Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into our third and final version of the Gigantic Brewing Company's most premium Russian Imperial Stout. Just was the prior to this one's 12% ABV. This specific version is bourbon barrel aged. Gigantic Brewing is based in Portland, Oregon. So the first two were really nice. That Scotch barrel was definitely a unique one. The last one that was flavored, and now we've got a bourbon barrel version. So standard base beer, bourbon barrel aged. So same label art as on all of them. It's got that kind of insectoid looking in czar kind of regalia. Looks quite cool. So nothing much to talk about that. Same as the others. We're going to get this cracked and poured right into the old stout glass here. Quite thick, quite dark. We're going to be aggressive here. See if I can give it a chance to form a head. Now, the first two didn't do that great of a job. Quite active in terms of carbonation. It just wanted to collapse as soon as it formed. This one, okay, but it's going to be gone very quickly, I can tell. Yep, same as the others, absolutely pitch black. So the head formed decently. It's already nearly gone. It's not going to score well there. It is what it is. It's just too active in terms of carbonation. Just as with the first two, the aroma is quite pungent. Even as you're pouring it a foot and a half away, you can really smell it. So we're going to get right up on it. Yep. Yeah, as expected. Tons of bourbon, tons of that rich roasted malt bill. I expected it just based on the prior two, so this one's no different. Quite a big, bold, pungent aroma. It smells fantastic. It looks the part. Let's jump in and see what this bourbon barrel aged version is all about. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's quite nice. It's quite nice. For a big 12% Russian with this barrel aging, it's maybe not quite as intense on the front as you expect. And I did recall experiencing that on the first two versions, but it still has a nice flavor profile at its core. The bourbon really speaks quite clearly, as does this underlying roasty malt bill. In this one, there's a lot more chocolatey kind of currents and overtones that are coming out of this malt bill. There's even a little bit of a coffee-like vibe to it as well. So this bourbon, aside from generally tasting like bourbon in the classic bourbon barrel, it does impart suggestions of sweetness, some kind of underlying vanilla notes, and even some caramelized sugar notes. And that paired with this malt bill that's nice and rich, has a lot of roasty underpinning, and is pulling out a little bit of this coffee-like and chocolate-like side. It really pairs quite well. It almost starts taking a turn into a direction of the flavor profile, the way the flavors that pop in and out mix together, tasting very dessert-like, which obviously this is not necessarily been brewed to be a dessert beer, but there's a lot of elements in it that taste like that, and it's quite nice. The other thing I can say, I kind of recall this from the first two. It's been a few weeks since I've had them, but yeah, for the size of this beer, the ABV and what they did with it, the finish on this is not as long as you would expect on the end of the sip. And indeed, the overall flavor pungency isn't quite as huge as you would normally associate with the 12% Russian Imperial that's been barrel aged. But what you do get is very tasty. So I'm going to jump back in for a second sip here. I'm going to let everything re-intensify, see if I missed anything, then we will pick apart this finish a little more in depth. But it's very nice beer. Equally as enjoyable as the prior two. Yeah, the body on this one doesn't feel as heavy as you would expect for 12%. The mouthfeel does have a decent bit of resistance. Agitation on the palate on this. It does not get silky. It does not get creamy. It doesn't get foamy. You can just feel the resistance of it. So the mouthfeel is definitely more impressive than the body. The mouthfeel feels where I would expect on a 12% R.I.S. The body, it doesn't feel as heavy. I would say overall, it's medium, maybe maybe on the border of medium heavy, but that's being generous. It doesn't feel oppressive. It doesn't feel super weighty. Some people will really appreciate that. Others will not. Others may be indifferent, but that's what I'm experiencing. So again, on second sip, letting everything re-intensify, the bourbon does absolutely pop out quite clearly. There's kind of vanilla-like currents, a kind of caramelized sugar currents, and it really does pair well with the elements of this malt bill. There's definitely a chocolate vibe. There's definitely a slight roasty coffee vibe. And on this second sip, I'm even getting elements of undercurrents of char. I didn't notice that on the first sip, but it is coming through. Now, part of that could be coming from the bourbon barrel itself, but it feels to my palate like it's coming from the malt bill. But it's very, very nice. And again, just as with the first two, I remember this, the finish is not as long as you would expect. I would say overall, for the style, it being barrel aged, average, maybe even low end, it's hovering in somewhere in there. It doesn't have quite the intensity to really drive it out on the back. And it's not a super bitter beer. It's not a super bitter profile. So lack of bitters are not driving. There is the barrel. That is the dominant where you're left with on the end, and just a little bit of that kind of underlying earthiness from the malt bill. But aside from its relative lack of length, everything that's in this beer is absolutely delicious. This is a well-crafted, very tasty Russian Imperial Stout. I love bourbon barrel beers. This one pairs extremely well with the bourbon barrels. I'm going to take my time, finish sipping on this one, come up with my scores. When we come back, we'll get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was Gigantic Brewing Company's most premium Russian Imperial Stout. This was the third and final version that I got in my 3-pack from Tavour. This was the bourbon barrel version. 12% ABV on this. Gigantic Brewing is based in Portland, Oregon. So, starting with the aroma. Just as with the first two, it was absolutely bold and pungent. The bourbon barrel really did jump out on this, as did the depth and roast of the malt. Tons of earthiness and roast mixed with that bourbon. It was absolutely fantastic. The aroma does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I absolutely loved all three of these. They were all slightly different. The barrel aging and the additives between them, taking the same base beer, just tweaking one little thing. It's such a cool thing that American craft brewers, and I'm sure global craft brewers, are doing as well. But it really goes to show us just how big of a difference one small change can make to a beer when everything else across the board is the same. And it really makes for a really interesting beer drinking experience, especially if you're being particularly peculiar and you're rating and you're taking tasting notes and aroma notes and the whole 9 yards. It's really, really cool, and I love the brewers are doing this, but I absolutely love the flavor on this one as much as I love the others. Bourbon really does pair well in this beer style in general, and they did a fantastic job. The taste on this one does get a 10 out of 10. For the body, I experienced this on the first two as well. The body felt far less robust than you would expect for a 12% Russian Imperial. It was really just kind of low end of average. Body does get a 4 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, as I recall, I didn't check scores, but if I recall correctly, kind of where the body was kind of all over the board on these, the mouthfeel on this one was actually really nice. There was a good bit of resistance on this beer, and it felt right for a 12% Russian Imperial. Quite a big contrast to the body, but the mouthfeel was top notch. Mouthfeel gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish, this was another one of the categories I remember from the others. A big beer, to be certain, and very tasty, also to be certain, but shockingly not extremely forward and bold in the intensity of the flavor. And that actually does play a part, a pretty big part, in how the finish plays out. So what I got in all of the beers, I loved. Absolutely delicious. But and it's rare that you get a 12% barrel-aged Russian Imperial Stout of all beer styles that doesn't have a big forward presence to it. These just didn't have that intensity on the front, which meant that, you know, after the initial kind of phase, it dropped off and it was far more subtle, which did prevent the finish from extending longer than your average, which you would normally expect on a barrel-aged R.I.S, but this really was just average. Finish does get a 5 out of 10. For the head and retention, just as with the others, it was not great. Just far too active in terms of carbonation. Head and retention on this one gets a 2 out of 10. For the appearance, textbook Imperial Stout, Russian or otherwise, perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional. The balance on all of them was exceptional. Their ingredient bill, the malts, the yeast, whatever they chose, in tandem with the barrels, the type of barrels and the amount of time, they really did a good job. They clearly paid acute attention and made them all slightly different, but kept it consistent with their differences and the amount of time and the volume. That made for an extremely well-balanced beer across the board. This third one, no difference. Balance does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the feeling and the intangible, subjectively, I loved it. I loved both of the prior versions. I loved this one equally as well. A bourbon barrel paired with the Russian Imperial is always a good time. Feeling and the intangible, 10 out of 10. Finally, it's an example of the style. So, this beer kind of was hit or miss. It got top marks in most categories, and then it missed some fairly large points in a few other key ones. Namely body, finish, head, and retention. Those were the big ones, and it was kind of across the board with all three versions. Head and retention, finish, body. These are important, but in the grand scheme of things about what makes a beer drinking experience, the experience of a style unique, and lets you really get invested in what it is that you're drinking, it's not that critical of categories. And I thought that in general, aside from its faults, it had many, many positive qualities. And I thought this was a truly delicious, truly well done barrel-aged Russian Imperial. I loved all three. This one was no exception. And I only docked 1 point here. I had to. It wasn't quite perfect, but I do sincerely believe all versions of this beer are a truly great example of what a barrel-aged or additive-added Russian Imperial Stout can be, very well executed. Example of style on this, docked 1 point, as I said, does get a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on the Gigantic Brewing's most premium Russian Imperial Stout Bourbon Barrel Aged version 2021 release to an 80 out of 100. So, before you balk, oh, 80, I'll skip that one. Same thing I said in the prior two. If we take these handful of categories that got lower scores and just said, okay, what if they got perfect? And these are categories that really don't detract that much from what the beer is actually about. The beer drinking, the flavor, the aroma, the intensity. It really is not that big of a deal. So I would encourage you for any of these three beers, including this one, forget about the score. The score is what it is. I had to rank it how I experienced it. But I would recommend any of these variants to anybody, especially if you're a fan of big Imperial Stouts in general or barrel-aged beers. These are absolutely up your alley, well worth your time. They were all delicious, all a little bit different, and just the experience of getting to take the same base beer and see what minor tweak they made, what a big change it made to the beer, absolutely worth it. I do recommend this to any big beer fan, and especially big barrel-aged stout fans. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to stay in the loop on our videos go live, just turn on your notifications. Hit that bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep your beer, keep your craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.